Good morning. Welcome to the April 2020 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, would you please introduce our agenda this morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. For today's meeting, you will hear 3 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking that would promote innovation and the use of mid-band spectrum for broadband by allowing unlicensed operations in the 5.925 to 7.125 gigahertz band while protecting existing licensed operations. Second, you will hear a notice of proposed rulemaking and order that would propose to establish the 5G Fund to award up to $9 billion in support in 2 phases for the deployment of 5G mobile broadband services in rural areas. Third, you will consider a report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking that would comprehensively update the Commission's orbital debris rule for all Commission-authorized satellites. This is your agenda for today. As expected, items 4 through 6, listed on the Thursday, April 16th Sunshine Notice, have been adopted by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first item, entitled Unlicensed Use of the 6 GHz Band, Expanding Flexible Use in Mid-Band Spectrum Between 3.7 and 24 GHz, will be presented by the Office of Engineering and Technology, and Ronald T. Rapazzi, Acting Chief of the Office, will give the introduction.
Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. And just before I turn it over to Mr. Rapazzi, let me take this opportunity to thank the FCC staff for all of the work they have done since we last gathered, from the COVID-19 telehealth program to the items that are on the agenda today, as well as the excellent staff from the CMR meeting team, including Jeff Reardon, who helped set up this call. I'm deeply appreciative for all of the work that you have done remotely in order to conduct Commission business while staying safe. And just know that you have our full support and gratitude. With that, Mr. Rapazzi, I would turn the floor over to you for a presentation of the item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to introduce a report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking that would create new opportunities for unlicensed use of the 6 gigahertz band. This item would expand by 1,200 megahertz the spectrum available for unlicensed operations, ideal for connecting devices in homes and businesses, and Internet of Things devices to the Internet. Nicholas Aros, our Deputy Chief of the Policy and Rules Division, will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This report and order would allow new and licensed use of 1,200 megahertz of spectrum in 5.925 to 7.125 gigahertz, or the 6 gigahertz band. In 2 portions of the band, totaling 850 megahertz of spectrum, standard power unlicensed access points will operate under the control of an Automated Frequency Coordination System, or AFC. The AFC will only permit the access points to operate at locations where they will not cause harmful interference to incumbent services that operate in these 2 portions of the 6 gigahertz band. Throughout the 6 gigahertz band, unlicensed access points will be permitted to operate indoors at lower power without the need for AFC control. The combination of lower power and indoor operations will protect licensed services operating in the 6 gigahertz band from harmful interference. The further notice proposes to create a new class of unlicensed devices that will operate across the entire 6 gigahertz band at very low power, both indoors and outdoors. The further notice also seeks comment on increasing the power at which the low power indoor access points may operate and allowing AFC-controlled access points to operate at higher powers for certain applications. The Office of Engineering Technology recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Rapazzi, for that introduction. Thank you, Mr. Oros, for that presentation and your observation of Take Our Daughters and Sons to Work Day. Glad to hear it. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a longer statement for the record, and I apologize. This one's going to be longer than what we had talked about informally, and I can't promise that at any moment my daughters may jump into this conversation, so I'll try my best to hold that off, but we'll go from there. Today is a fantastic day for unlicensed services and the millions of Americans who use them. Opening 6 gigahertz for unlicensed use has been a priority for me, culminating decades of my work on the broader issue. I'm exceptionally pleased that we're finally taking the appropriate and defensible steps to free up this needed spectrum resource. Except for one other smaller but equally important spectrum slice, there is no greater opportunity for expanding unlicensed services, especially in Wi-Fi. Now, we add the full 1,200 megahertz of 6 gigahertz spectrum for low-power indoor devices that will be available and able to increase speed and capacity, relieve congestion, decrease latency, and bring about the next generation of unlicensed innovation, including Wi-Fi 6 and 6E in the near term. We also take the critical approach of authorizing standard power on licensed services with higher power limits than LPI using an automated frequency coordination system, which the Commission helped pioneer and with which it is very familiar. Well, some argue that the unlicensed community does not need the full 1,200 megahertz of spectrum. I strongly disagree. Instead of doling out unlicensed spectrum in slivers or piecemeal through some dividend mechanism, we have the chance to provide a huge, much-needed infusion of wireless currency to American innovators and entrepreneurs who will undoubtedly amaze us with their ingenuity. Moreover, to obtain unlicensed 5G-like capabilities, 160 megahertz channels or eventually 320 megahertz under Wi-Fi 7 are absolutely necessary. And this allocation for unlicensed services will accelerate rather than compete with the American effort to deploy nationwide 5G advanced wireless services. Today's action is also very timely, as the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the importance of our Wi-Fi systems in keeping those in isolation connected to the outside world. Not to mention, the benefits well extend beyond these current circumstances. It is expected that unlicensed use will continue to experience tremendous growth in the coming years, which could lead to devastating congestion in our existing networks if not for this additional spectrum. This allocation will also facilitate other exceedingly important developments, providing affordable spectrum to expand broadband networks to the unserved and most remote parts of the nation, expanding the Internet of Things and increasing the availability of industrial applications. All of these enormous benefits can only be realized by authorizing both standard power operations and LPI devices, which, unlike the high power systems, do not need an AFC. While there's been much debate about whether an LPI can cause interference to fixed networks, electronic news gathering, and other incumbent uses, the studies in the record and the analysis of the talented professionals in the Office of Engineering and Technology are quite clear. Unlicensed use, with the technical rules set out in this item, can be introduced without causing harmful interference. In fact, today's item takes a very conservative approach and relegates some technical issues to the further notice section. I am very supportive of the increasing the power spectral density of LPI devices from 5 to 8 dBm per megahertz and introducing new, very low power devices in the band with the appropriate technical parameters. Well, I was very hopeful that we would adopt these measures in today's order. I understand that our engineers would like to develop a more robust record on these issues. I firmly believe that increasing LPI power and VLP can be done while protecting incumbent users, and I assert that there are few greater priorities for the Commission than completing the further order this year. I also appreciate that my suggested edits were accepted by my colleagues. These include setting the allowable client device power by rule instead of basing it on the actual transmissional power of an access point at any given point in time, seeking comment in the further notice on the portable use of standard power devices, and making the VLP section neutral so it does not steer commenters to certain conclusions. Further, I am pleased at my request the item provides more structure and direction to the new multi-stakeholder group and seeks comment on the possible use of higher power limits for fixed point-to-point applications and directional antennas for standard power access points, among others. Now that this item is to be adopted and the bulk of the work on the C-band proceedings is over, it is time to refocus our attention on 5.9 gigahertz band for unlicensed, the 3.1 to 3.55 gigahertz band for exclusive license use, and other bands that will be needed for commercial wireless use in the future. Broadly, our action here should allow the Commission to triple our efforts to identify and reallocate bands for new licensed services, and I will continue to push this Commission to do the hard work to find the next 5G bands. Let's roll up our sleeves and refill that pipeline. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. We'll now turn to Commissioner Khare.
Thanks. The stories you'll soon read about this vote will speak volumes about its significance. You'll read about the FCC supercharging Wi-Fi, and you'll read about the big boost we're giving to applications so many Americans rely on today, from our connected TVs to the devices we use to stream content or complete those online video calls we're now all too familiar with. All of those takes will be right. And yet, when we look back at this decision years from now, I have a feeling that none of those applications will be the ones we talk about when we discuss the innovations powered by these 1,200 megahertz of spectrum. Now, part of this stems from a very human limitation on our thinking. We tend to underestimate the pace and nature of technological change. We assume that the next big thing will just be a faster version of what we have today. Our brains can understand faster Wi-Fi, but struggle with the more visionary applications that are right around the corner. This isn't a new phenomenon. Henry Ford reportedly said that if he'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. We even called the first cars horseless carriages. And to belabor the analogy, what we're voting on today isn't higher quality hay for the horses, it's high octane stuff. And that's why studies show that our decision will add nearly $200 billion to the economy when added with other unlicensed bands. So I suspect this order will not be remembered because it enabled faster Netflix downloads. We don't know what the future holds, but maybe the present pandemic gives us some clues about what's around the corner. Millions of kids, including mine, are out of school today and stuck at home. Teachers and parents are working hard to keep them learning. Some are turning to video calls to enhance their in-home education. But even that doesn't capture the feedback between student and teacher that exists in the classroom. Educators we've spoken with say it's particularly difficult to teach hands-on subjects like science. Today's decision can help change that by unleashing a new wave of virtual reality applications. Imagine the immersive learning experience students could enjoy in a virtual 3D environment. Well, Facebook's Oculus currently has a VR solution used to teach medical students. And just months ago, it launched a VR pilot project at a Seattle area high school. Or take grocery shopping. With the pandemic, many Americans are now standing in lines that snake around for blocks while maintaining 6 feet of separation. Instead of all that, imagine putting on VR glasses while sitting on your couch at home, walking virtually down the aisle at your local store, and quickly looking at, picking up, and choosing items. Instant checkout, immediate delivery, no contact. This type of transformative VR can solve pain points in our daily lives. And getting to that near future requires a next-gen connection. Even with the world's strongest 5G network, engineers tell us that VR devices will be powered by the unlicensed spectrum bands we free up today. Enabling those new connections will help drive the entire 5G ecosystem forward. So I'm pleased to support today's order, and I want to thank the chairman and my colleagues for seeking further comment on greenlighting very low power operations at power levels that will work in the real world, because those may be the key links that unlock some of those immersive VR devices. Finally, I want to thank OET, the Wireless Bureau, and so many others at the Commission for their work on what is truly a historic item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner Khare. We'll now turn to Commissioner Wersal.
Thanks. Not long after the invention of the personal computer, experts predicted that jobs would eventually be liberated from the office and home would be the future of work. Well, it didn't quite happen that way, but sometimes a powerful force can strike and change everything. So consider ourselves struck. This virus has ushered in remote work at unprecedented scale. Not everyone, to be sure. Doctors and nurses are still working at hospitals, first responders are out in our communities, and so many other essential workers are helping keep our pantry stocked and packages delivered, and we salute them. But millions more of us are doing our part by staying at home. I know, I'm one of them. I also know there is a technology my household is relying on like never before. That's Wi-Fi. Because in this crisis, work, school, healthcare, and so much more have migrated online. And if we're lucky, we're using Wi-Fi to call, stream, and create at home as part of our broadband service. But remember that others are driving with devices to get online. In this pandemic, parking lot Wi-Fi has become a thing as people get in their cars to go find a signal in communities where internet access at home is scarce. That needs attention because it is a stark reminder that when it comes to digital equity, we have work to do. It also proves just how extensively we are relying on Wi-Fi right now. Then consider that even before we reach this juncture, the unlicensed airwaves that Wi-Fi depends on have been growing crowded. Already, the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands are used by billions of devices in the Internet of Things, and that number is only poised to grow. Then consider that when we head to our 5G future, we expect as much as 70% of traffic to be offloaded to unlicensed airwaves. And take note that with fiber, cable, and commercial wireless all moving to gigabit speeds, existing Wi-Fi risks being the bottleneck for faster speeds at home. Without making more and more wide channels available, our online experiences are going to feel a lot like getting off a superhighway and onto a gravel road. We need to act. We need more unlicensed spectrum to carry all of the wireless activity that's coming our way. So when the FCC decided to explore the expansion of Wi-Fi in the 6 gigahertz band, I called for the agency to make available 1,200 megahertz of new spectrum to support next generation Wi-Fi, 160 megahertz wide channels that can offer gigabit speeds. And today we do just that. As a result, this effort has my support. I also appreciate that my colleagues have agreed to changes at my request, including clarifying power levels for client devices and seeking comment on opportunities for portable devices and the right power levels for very low power devices. In addition, I want to thank Commissioner O'Reilly for his early work to champion these policies and his willingness to do so with my office. Finally, I want to recognize that today's decision with our action today, we make progress on the need to identify additional bans for unlicensed use under the Ray-Bounds Act. So with this decision on unlicensed spectrum, we do well by the law, we add more permissionless wireless airwaves to the economy, and we expand the democratizing force of having more Wi-Fi in more places. Amen. Those are good things to do in this crisis and for the days ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner Wersal. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The COVID-19 pandemic may be the most challenging event of our generation. While healthcare workers and first responders help those suffering from the coronavirus, grocery store and essential retail workers, bus drivers, transportation and delivery personnel all continue to perform their hard work so that we can get the goods and services that we need. And for those listening to this meeting online, social distancing may mean working from home, distance learning for kids, and video conferencing to stay in touch with colleagues and loved ones. But for millions of Americans without broadband connections, the response to COVID-19 has meant isolation. It has meant weeks, if not months, without instruction for their kids. And it has meant hard decisions about whether to tough out a troubling health issue or risk traveling to a doctor's office or an emergency room. The 6 gigahertz report and order, like the other items we discussed today, reflect an important aspect of the FCC's role in bridging the digital divide. For many people without broadband at home, getting online means relying on shared or public Wi-Fi connections in their neighborhood, the library, or even that local fast food place. And I particularly remember my visit to the Larkin Street Youth Services Center in San Francisco, where I heard from countless homeless teens about how they rely on the facility's Wi-Fi services in order to stay connected. Today's decision makes 1200 megahertz in the 6 gigahertz band available for unlicensed use and holds special promise for all of these Americans, even for those who can't afford the new equipment that will take advantage of new spectrum and the latest iteration of Wi-Fi. The speeds for their devices should increase as existing Wi-Fi traffic moves to the new spectrum. Low-income consumers purchasing discounted broadband plans will realize the full benefits of their subscriptions as the Wi-Fi channels within their homes become less congested and data flows more freely. The new spectrum is also expected to spur new efforts by many broadband providers, retailers, restaurants, and others that offer public Wi-Fi access at hotspots across the nation. The benefits of this decision truly don't stop there. The 6 gigahertz spectrum is expected to complement 5G wireless service and unleash a wave of innovation for the Internet of Things. It will allow doctors to conduct complex examinations and procedures remotely, enable the training of students and workers using virtual and augmented reality, and spur the next generation of streaming content and gaming. Finally, I do look forward to a rapid resolution of the issues presented in the FNPRM. In particular, I hope that we can quickly determine whether and how to increase the power levels for low-power indoor operations. Higher power levels will ensure that people can connect to Wi-Fi throughout their homes without additional equipment that could be too costly or complicated for some Americans. Thank you to the Commission staff for their hard work in resolving this complicated engineering issues here, as always.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Starks. For my part, I as well will have a longer statement, but for now, I will note, as my colleagues have, that the coronavirus pandemic has changed nearly every aspect of our lives. For many of us, Wi-Fi has been a critical part of our new reality. It's helped us keep connected to our families and friends, as well as the outside world. It's enabled children to take part in distance learning. It's allowed Americans with medical issues to have virtual doctor's appointments. And for some unspecified others, perhaps, though I'm not confirming me, it has enabled people to stream Tiger King on Netflix. And Wi-Fi will be even more important in the years to come. By one estimate, the economic value created by Wi-Fi in the United States is projected to double by 2023, reaching nearly $1 trillion. Now, the good news is that the next generation of Wi-Fi has already started rolling out. Wi-Fi 6 will be over 2.5 times faster than the current standard, and it will offer better performance for connected devices. But in order to fully take advantage of the benefits of Wi-Fi 6, we need to make more mid-band spectrum available for unlicensed use. And so today, we take a bold step to increase the supply of unlicensed spectrum. We're making the entire 6 gigahertz band, a massive 1,200 megahertz testbed for innovators and innovation, available for unlicensed use. By doing this, we are effectively increasing the amount of mid-band spectrum available for Wi-Fi by almost a factor of 5. This will be a huge benefit to consumers and innovators across the nation. Ultimately, I expect that 6 gigahertz unlicensed devices will become a part of consumers' everyday lives, and I predict the rules we adopt today will play a major role in the growth of the Internet of Things, connecting appliances and other consumer electronics, as well as industrial sensors for manufacturing, among many other applications and services we can't even conceive today. At the same time, our approach will ensure that incumbents in the 6 gigahertz band are protected from harmful interference. Now, in addition to the report and order, today's further notice of proposed rulemaking explores possibilities for very low power devices in the 6 gigahertz band. We look forward to compiling a strong record and acting quickly to make 6 gigahertz available for these very low-power uses. I want to thank, as my colleagues have, all of our hardworking FCC staff. This is one of the most complicated proceedings from an engineering perspective that the Commission has encountered in many years, and we would not have reached this point were not for the efforts of the folks in the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and others throughout the agency. Terrific work on this item, and it has my full-throated support. With that, we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Votes aye.
Commissioner Khare?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thank you again, team, for the great work on this item. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force and Wireline Competition Bureau and is entitled Establishing a 5G Fund for Rural America. Michael Jansen, Director of the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Jansen, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners and Madam Secretary. The Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force and the Wireline Competition Bureau present for your consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking and order that, if adopted, will support the build-out of 5G mobile broadband networks in areas that likely would otherwise go unserved, so that Americans in rural communities gain access to communications options on par with those offered in urban areas. I would like to thank the staff of the Auctions Division in the Office of Economics and Analytics for their assistance with drafting this item. Valerie Barish will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This notice of proposed rulemaking, if adopted, will propose and seek comment on establishing the 5G Fund for Rural America as a replacement for Mobility Fund Phase 2 to retarget universal service funds to support deployment of mobile 5G service in rural areas. The notice will propose and seek comment on a budget of up to $9 billion to be awarded in 2 phases using multi-round descending clock reverse auctions with a 10-year term of support. Phase 1 would award up to $8 billion to areas unlikely to see deployment of 5G service absent support or as part of T-Mobile's transaction-related rural deployment commitments, with $680 million of that budget reserved for service to tribal lands. Phase 2 would award at least $1 billion for harder to serve and higher cost areas, such as farms and ranches, specifically targeting deployments that facilitate precision agriculture. The notice will also seek comment on 2 options for identifying areas eligible for support. Under option A, eligible areas would be identified based primarily on the degree of rurality of each area, with support prioritized to areas that have historically lacked 3G and 4G LTE services. Under this option, the notice estimates that the Commission could award funding through an auction in 2021. Under option B, eligible areas would be identified based upon improved mobile broadband deployment maps developed using coverage data collected through the new Digital Opportunity Data Collection. Under this option, the notice estimates that the Commission could award funding through an auction in 2023 or later. Further, the notice will propose using census tracts as the minimum geographic area for bidding, using an adjustment factor that considers the relative cost of serving different areas to distribute support, public interest obligations, performance requirements, reporting and non-compliance measures for both legacy high-cost support and 5G fund support recipients, and eligibility and application requirements for 5G fund auction participants and winning bidders. The companion order, if adopted, will, among other things, direct the Office of Economics and Analytics and the Wireline Competition Bureau to propose and seek comment on methodologies and values for an adjustment factor. The Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force and the Wireline Competition Bureau recommend adoption of this notice of proposed rulemaking and order and request editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barish and Mr. Jansen, for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This item seeks to forge a path forward for the long-standing mess that was the Mobility Fund Phase 2 proceeding, proposing to fund the deployment of 5G service to unserved rural Americans while seeking comment on 2 separate and alternative approaches. The item is very well intended, and I applaud steps to reform our current mobility legacy high-cost support program. It should go without saying that as a huge proponent of 5G and the benefits it will bring to the Americans and our economy. I appreciate the Commission's focus on ways to facilitate its deployment nationwide, especially in the harder to reach parts of America. Nonetheless, I do have certain questions and concerns with respect to some of the proposals and conclusions of the item, and will have to be worked out before the proceeding ever goes to final order. Overall, it's certainly worthy of our support at the MPRM stage, and I approve its adoption today. And I'll insert a longer statement for the record, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Khare.
Thank you. In 2015 and 2016, the U.S. was at serious risk of ceding global leadership in 5G to China and to our other global competitors. Back then, it took too long and cost too much to build internet infrastructure in this country. Since then, we have executed on a concrete plan to turn things around. And that plan is now delivering results. Internet speeds are up about 85% since year-end 2016. More miles of high-speed fiber were built out last year, connecting our homes and cell sites than ever before. In small cells, the building blocks for 5G have been installed at a record-setting clip. The U.S. now has the strongest 5G platform in the world. That network will help power our economy out of this COVID-19 downturn and support America's next great comeback. In all of this, regulations matter. Under our 5G plan, we cut red tape that only drove up costs and held back internet bills. We freed up more spectrum than any other country in the world, including taking on those thorny spectrum bands that past commissions opted just not to deal with. And those decisions are why 5G is live today, not just in New York and San Francisco, but in places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Peachtree Corners, Georgia. With all that progress, there's still a lot of work ahead. We want every community in the country to have a fair shot at next-gen connectivity. And there are many Americans in rural areas where there's no business case for building 5G networks. To close that gap, we're now proposing the largest effort ever to support high-speed mobile networks in communities across the country. I'm pleased that we seek comment today on ways we can move forward quickly, including whether we should use the best available data now or wait until improved mapping information is available. And I'm glad that we're targeting at least $1 billion for the support of precision agriculture applications. I've seen firsthand from Indiana to Nebraska to South Dakota that America's farmers and ranchers are leveraging cutting-edge technologies, from drones to connected combines, in their effort to feed the world. I'm glad that they will have our support. I want to thank the staff of the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Wireless Bureau, and the Office of Economics and Analytics for their really hard work on this item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner Khare. Commissioner Wersal.
It was a year and a half ago that Corey Chase took to the roads of Vermont. He crisscrossed the state, driving on everything from the biggest highways to the smallest stretches of dirt and gravel. And he didn't log 6,000 miles in a car to take in the fall leaves. He was doing his job. That's because Corey Chase is a Vermont employee, and he was charged with testing the availability of wireless service in every corner of the Green Mountain State. To do this, he took more than 180,000 speed tests using 6 different devices with 6 different service plans and too many tanks of gas to count. And he set out on this quest because the state believed that the wireless maps at the Federal Communications Commission, or what was then called Mobility Fund 2, suggested there was a whole lot more service in the state than its residents recognized. So the agency told stakeholders to put in the work, do tests, and prove it. And a lot of them did, because Corey Chase was not alone. In fact, more than 20 million speed tests were submitted to the FCC in a nationwide effort to demonstrate serious flaws in the FCC's wireless maps. So But this history matters because it wasn't that long ago. Now fast forward to the present. The FCC has scrapped the effort to have stakeholders improve our wireless maps. It passed on the work of Corey Chase and so many others. Instead of using their work to fix our maps and get a clear picture of where deployment is and is not, the agency threw up its hands and canceled the whole Mobility Fund 2 effort. And in its place, we have what we introduced today, the new 5G fund. It sounds good, because we still have places in this country where signals are scarce and wireless service is hard to find. But this do-over has serious flaws. We're not just ignoring all the problems with mapping that came before, we're at risk at making the same mistakes again. Here's why. First, this 5G rulemaking presents a false choice. It suggests we can either provide funds for more wireless service fast, or we can do it accurately. That's crazy. We need to do both. If we're going to spend billions in public funds on improving wireless service in rural America, it's not too much to ask that we do it with speed and get it right. Under what my colleagues call Option A, the FCC would commit $8 billion over the next 10 years without any new maps. This would lock up the bulk of our universal service funds for improving wireless service for a decade without an honest accounting of where service is and is not. This is a mistake. Under Option B, the FCC says it will roll up its sleeves and do the work to make improvements to our maps and then distribute funds accordingly. But it says it can't possibly do this for at least 3 years. This too is a mistake. In fact, the entire framing here is wrong. We can do two things at once. We can work fast and base our efforts on facts. Second, we need maps before money and data before deployment, because that is just what Congress told us to do in the Broadband Data Act, which was signed into law last month. It set forth very specific requirements designed to improve the FCC's broadband maps for wired and wireless service. And this data was supposed to inform the agency's distribution of universal service to expand the reach of service in rural America. You know, I'm not the only one who thinks so. Just this week, Senators Manchin, Lankford, Tester, and Hyde-Smith wrote us with a simple plea that we do this in the right order because we, quote, can never deliver on the promise of universal service without accurate broadband coverage maps, unquote. They're right. Third and finally, today's effort fails to properly examine the lessons learned from Mobility Fund 2. In fact, the FCC terminates the Mobility Fund 2 docket. Why? What are we hiding? For the record, some of our past mistakes in that docket include having carriers file maps that bore too little relation to reality. They include running a costly challenge process that required Corey Chase to drive thousands of miles on Vermont roads. They include failing to hold anyone accountable after our staff found that some of our largest carriers filed inaccurate mapping data with this agency. It seems that by doubling the money and wiping the slate clean, the FCC hopes that no one will notice. That's not right. Starting over may be a necessary course, but we should find a better way forward. We can learn from what came before. We can do the work required in the Broadband Data Act to identify where funds should go, and we can do this with both speed and accuracy. Because if we do, we can honestly and accurately support the expansion of wireless service in rural communities nationwide, and that, after all, should be our goal. So while I approve the idea behind this fund, I dissent in all other respects.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Access to broadband helps rural areas tap into economic and educational opportunities that may not be close to home, which encourages young people to stay and attracts new residents and employers. To promote these economic and social benefits, I strongly support the notice of proposed rulemaking's goal of bringing state-of-the-art wireless service to all Americans, especially those in rural communities. I look forward to a robust public feedback on the many important questions raised in the NPRM. I cannot, however, endorse the false choice between speed and accuracy that it sets forth. Because I believe we can and should target this funding using the new coverage maps Congress has ordered us to develop, I must dissent in part. Option A would distribute funding based on degrees of rurality without finishing the corrected maps required by the Broadband Data Act. Making funding decisions, particularly for such a long period, without accurate deployment data is, I believe, bad policy for all the reasons I outlined with respect to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. In this case, it also creates a raft of practical problems. The NPRM proposes, for example, to prioritize areas historically lacking mobile service. But how will we do that? the only option the NPRM considers is using the Form 477 data that, as the NPRM also acknowledges, does, quote, not really reflect actual on-the-ground coverage in many instances, close quote. Relying again on bad coverage data would be an insult to the many state and local governments, organizations, and individuals who invested time and money in the failed Mobility Fund Phase 2 challenge process. It would also knowingly avoid Congress's directive that we make funding decisions based on better data by stalling the critical effort to fix our maps. The NPRM asserts that option A complies with the Broadband Data Act because the Commission does not have to base funding decisions on new maps until there are new maps. And even if that satisfies the letter of the law, option A boldly ignores the spirit of the Broadband Data Act. It looks to me like the Commission is sidestepping the statute by deprioritizing and dragging out the mapping process. When it comes to maps, we are only waiting on ourselves. The Broadband Data Act requires the Commission to adopt final new mapping rules by September 2020 at the latest. The premise of option A is that we cannot expect those new maps to be completed until even a year after that. And if that is true, I think it's because the Commission has not fully prioritized this work. The chairman announced the creation of the 5G Fund on December 4th, 2019, nearly 5 months ago. Imagine how much closer to a well-targeted 5G fund we would be if we had committed the necessary resources on that very day to producing and finalizing accurate maps, full speed ahead. If you need a longer time horizon, consider where we would be if we had fully committed to that effort in December 2018 when the chairman announced the investigation into carriers that had submitted inaccurate coverage data. The point, we could have chosen to prioritize, invest the Commission's resources in getting the mapping project moving. We could have done this a better way. Instead, I believe we proposed another 10-year, multi-billion-dollar commitment that, when combined with RDOF, could mean that the vast majority of our high-cost support is spent chasing bad data for yet another decade. For these reasons, I believe option A should not even be under consideration, and I cannot agree.
Thanks, Commissioner. In many rural areas, you quickly notice how dependent you have become on mobile broadband. That mobile connection is a powerful tool for connecting Americans with family, jobs, doctors, and teachers wherever they go, and it's lacking in many rural areas. As the rollout of 5G happens in the United States, we must ensure that rural Americans are not left behind. More than 200 million, mostly urban and suburban Americans have access to 5G mobile broadband. We've taken decisive action to bring 5G to rural America, like conditioning our approval of the T-Mobile Sprint merger on the company's enforceable commitment to deploy 5G to 90% of rural Americans within 6 years. But without further action, Americans living in the most remote and sparsely populated areas could be left behind. That's not acceptable to me. And that's why I announced my plan for a $9 billion 5G fund for rural America last December. Now, some question why we should spend money to deploy 5G to rural America when some parts of our country still lack 3G or 4G. But it doesn't make any sense at the dawn of the 5G era to spend our universal service funds to deliver networks using predecessor technologies that will be outdated by the time they're operational. We cannot and we will not condemn rural wireless consumers to a continual game of catch-up. This notice tees up two different approaches for comment. One option would aggressively target those rural areas that are least likely to see 5G coverage absent support by using current data to identify particularly rural areas and to prioritize those that historically lacked 4G LTE or even 3G service. The other option would delay any 5G support until the new, granular, precise broadband coverage maps that the FCC is developing in its digital opportunity data collection are complete. There are advantages and disadvantages to each approach. It's often said that governing is about making choices, and that's the case here. We will have to decide whether enhanced precision justifies a significant delay, as much as 2 additional years. And I look forward to having that conversation with my fellow commissioners and other stakeholders. What we cannot do is pretend that there is no trade-off between precision and speed. that we can magically fiat both perfect knowledge and immediate distribution of funds. We can't have our cake and eat it too. Today's notice also seeks comment on several other important proposals, too numerous to mention here, and I look forward to seeing how this record develops. In the meantime, I appreciate the great work of our team on the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force and elsewhere in the Commission, as well as the broad support this initiative has gotten from those who represent rural America, such as the Rural Ag Council, the National Grange, the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, American Agri-Women, Land O'Lakes, and many others. I appreciate your support and look forward to delivering on the opportunity that 5G presents for rural America in the days to come. With that, we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Khare?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve in part, dissent in part.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve in part, dissent in part.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 3 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the International Bureau and is entitled Mitigation of Orbital Debris in the New Space Age. Tom Sullivan, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The International Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration this draft report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking addressing mitigation of orbital debris. I would like to thank the International Bureau Orbital Debris team, especially Carl Kensinger, our colleagues in the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Office of General Counsel, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and our space-related agency partners for their contributions to this proceeding. I would like to introduce Marissa Velez, an attorney advisor in the Satellite Division, who will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking addresses the Commission's rules governing the mitigation of orbital debris. This action represents the first comprehensive look at the Commission's orbital debris rules since their adoption in 2004. These updates reflect the experience and practices developed in the Commission's satellite licensing processes since 2004, would help to ensure that the Commission's rules remain up to date in addressing technical and market changes that impact orbital debris mitigation, and would incorporate important improvements in mitigation practices and guidance into the Commission's rules. The order would add numerical values into the Commission's application disclosure rules on collision risk, probability of successful post-emission disposal, and casualty risk. The order would also adopt new disclosure requirements on topics such as how satellites will protect inhabitable spacecraft and satellite trackability and identification, among other things. Additionally, the new rules would update the process for geostationary orbit satellite license extension. The further notice of proposed rulemaking would seek additional comment on several matters associated with larger systems of non-geostationary satellites, including assessing collision risk and casualty risk on a system-wide basis. The further notice would also seek comment on a maneuverability requirement for satellites operating above a certain altitude in low Earth orbit. Additionally, the further notice would seek input on an indemnification requirement, as well as on a bond that would be tied to successful post-emission disposal. The International Bureau recommends adoption of this report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for that introduction, and Ms. Velez for that compelling presentation. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is clear that FCC orbital debris rules from 2004 are simply not adequate to protect space users from the potential threats presented by the collision of natural or human-created masses. Although technology has improved and new models are available to evaluate and mitigate space trash, a proliferation of man-made objects, literally projectiles of all sizes, continues hurtling through orbits used for satellites, spacecraft, and International Space Station. For those reasons, I support today's efforts to update our orbital debris rules. There has been much talk about what role, if any, the Commission has to play here. With this item, I'm pleased the chairman ultimately agrees with my position that the FCC is neither prohibited from acting nor should it act unilaterally. Ultimately, the FCC provides licenses or grants market access for these satellite services, so we play a role in the good stewardship of space. We can't sit on the sidelines, argue we have no responsibility or authority over the issue, or pass the buck entirely to other agencies. On the other hand, it is also not appropriate for the Commission to single-handedly micromanage and attempt to regulate space as there's no other agencies with far more expertise in certain aspects of space travel and orbital debris than the FCC. Well, the draft circulated prior to today's meeting had serious sections that caused me some concern. I thank the chairman and my colleagues for accepting my proposed edits. At my suggestion, we move some issues from the order to the further notice, including mitigating the collision and casualty risks and what maneuverability is appropriate for these large constellations. It was apparent that some of the metrics in the circulated item would have forced total redesigns of planned networks or doomed projects altogether. Two other things of note. Today's item imposes numerous disclosure obligations on topics such as trackability, deployment devices used, the release of persistent liquids, and post-mission disposal. While there is no direct harm in collecting information, it often leads to unnecessarily cost burdens for industry. We also need to figure out how case-by-case decisions made during the review of one entity's application, but which may serve as precedent for others, are made publicly available. Finally, the issue of whether satellite companies should be required to indemnify the U.S. for any harm from their satellite operations was appropriately moved to the further notice, joining the post-mission disposal bond proposal. Paying for long-term bonds and determining the uncertain liability of indemnification will greatly increase overall cost, affecting financing and severely disadvantaged small businesses, entrepreneurs, and new entrants. If the U.S. wants to be a leader in the current space race, our regulatory processes cannot be more expensive and burdensome than those of other nations. This is not the last time the Commission will be looking into this matter, and I plan to follow these issues very closely. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Oh, I think you jumped the line.
You want to go to Commissioner Khare?
Commissioner Khare, you've been demoted, but I will rectify that now and turn to Commissioner Khare.
I'll take the demotion and the promotion back. Look, it's no secret that I've been skeptical of the FCC's jurisdiction and expertise when it comes to regulating orbital debris. Analyzing collision risk, spacecraft maneuverability, ionic sodium potassium droplets, tubular cylinder deployers, and separation rings, these are not within the Commission's core competencies, to say the least. Now, some may dismiss my concerns by saying that there are a lot of smart people at the FCC, and there certainly are, and that this stuff isn't rocket science, except it is. It is literally rocket science we're wading into. Many stakeholders have now echoed those concerns over the past few weeks. And that's why I welcomed the chance to work with stakeholders and my colleagues on edits that have greatly improved the document we vote on today. I want to thank Commissioner Starks in particular for his willingness to collaborate on a series of really important changes to the document. The changes we propose together align this item much more closely with the positions held by expert agencies that have experience in aerospace engineering, like NASA, NOAA, and the FAA. As a result of our edits, the Commission now adopts our sister agencies' large object collision and casualty risk standards. We now seek further comment on spacecraft maneuverability and indemnification requirements, and we now take a more cautious and appropriately balanced approach to our bond proposal. With those substantial edits to the item, I can now support it. So I want to thank the International Bureau for all of its really hard work on this decision, and I want to express my appreciation again to Commissioner Starks for his leadership on these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Khare. And now, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right. These days, it is hard to think about anything more than the here and now. But if the present crisis has taught us anything, it's that getting ahead of the problems is important. This is the best way to prepare for the future, and that future is full of challenges, some known, some unknown. Among the former is the explosion of activity in space, courtesy of so many new constellations and satellite systems. Preparing for this rush is important because the opportunities are big, but to realize them, we have to get the growing challenge of orbital debris under control. That's because so much has changed in the space world since the FCC last updated its orbital debris rules in 2004. Back then, there were about 800 satellites in operation and roughly 10,000 pieces of orbital debris larger than 10 centimeters. Today, there are more than 2,200 operational satellites, 22,300 pieces of orbital debris larger than 10 centimeters, and nearly 1 million pieces of debris larger than 1 centimeter. Plus, over the last year or so, this agency has approved more than 13,000 new satellites for launch. More are headed our way. So the potential for debris and collisions is multiplying fast. How do we plan for this future? Well, we act now to get ahead of it. And to this end, after more than a year of work, we now have an update to the United States government orbital debris mitigation standard practices, thanks to an interagency process led by NASA and required by Space Policy Directive 3. So now it falls to the FCC to update its own rules. And while we should strive to harmonize our policies with this earlier federal update, we also need to be honest and recognize its scope. That's because the issues raised by large constellations are far more urgent in commercial activity, where they are already being designed, built, and launched. Moreover, we need to recognize the FCC has unique authority. We are the only ones with jurisdiction over commercial space activities. That makes our work to update the agency's 2004 orbital debris policies really important. And after more than a year of review, our staff developed a range of good ideas. So there were a few issues like indemnification where we needed to ask deeper questions and learn more. And now we do just that thanks to the willingness of my colleagues to work together and improve what was initially proposed. But I concur today because while this is a start, there is so much more we need to do. To that end, we are passing on one of the most important opportunities we teed up in the rulemaking that kicked off this proceeding, tightening the 25-year rule that allows a satellite and debris from its launch to stay in orbit for 25 years after its mission ends. This rule simply does not make sense in today's orbital environment. According to a NASA study of large constellations, if we fail to start deorbiting satellites that have completed their missions within a more reasonable time frame, the likelihood of catastrophic collisions is going to grow. While I would have preferred that we address it here, I appreciate my colleagues are willing to continue this conversation and in further rulemaking. I also would have preferred the agency make more progress today on collision risks for large constellations, accidental explosion risk, and maneuverability issues. Going forward, we need to prepare for the future with more speed and urgency if we want the United States to retain our global authority in space matters, because we are not the only ones looking to the skies for innovation and economic growth. European leaders have already approved funding for the first active debris removal mission. Japan is funding an effort to develop commercial debris removal service too. I'm convinced we can play a leadership role, but to do so, more work on these issues is necessary.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While much of the focus has been on the urban areas that have certainly paid the heaviest price during the COVID-19 pandemic, the coronavirus spares truly no community. In the last few weeks, we've heard about Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which now has by far the largest number of COVID-19 cases per capita of any Midwestern state. Other areas like Randolph County, Illinois, Osage County, Oklahoma, and Albany, Georgia are all experiencing surges of infections that could quickly challenge their resources. Broadband is a key weapon in the fight against this virus. With good broadband connection, people can limit the spread of the disease while remaining in touch with work, participating in distance learning, and receiving medical treatment where they can via telemedicine. Yet for many rural communities that are coping with the first wave of infections, COVID-19 has brought home the consequence of internet inequality. In Missouri, Marys County has not even attempted a remote learning program because 30% of its students lack broadband access. Following a wave of local hospital closures, small towns throughout the United States are struggling with how they will care with COVID-19 patients with no local doctors and no telemedicine capabilities. Communities like these may not be focused on what we do here today on orbital debris policy, but today's decision should help them by accelerating the growth of the latest generation of satellite broadband. This technology uses low Earth orbit satellites to provide internet connectivity with latency and speed superior to existing satellite broadband options and competitive with cable and fiber offerings. While traditional broadband providers start their networks from urban centers and expand outwards, satellite providers can provide service to everyone once their satellites are operational, regardless of where they live or the population density of that community. Next-gen satellite broadband technology holds tremendous promise for connecting people in the hardest-to-reach communities in America, and I'm excited that American companies like SpaceX and Amazon are leading this burgeoning industry. I deeply appreciate the collaboration that I had with Commissioner Khare on our shared concerns with the original draft of this decision, and that the chairman responded to those concerns. I strongly believe that we should pay close attention to NASA's expertise when it comes to setting specific standards in space policy. In particular, I'm glad that we revised language regarding two aspects of the draft rules that would have had significantly inhibited the growth of next-generation satellite broadband. The draft originally adopted a standard for collision risk that departed from NASA's recommendations to assess that risk on a per-satellite basis, and similarly, the draft adopted a casualty risk standard that differed from NASA's recommendations on those issues. And while we should do our utmost to reduce the risk of collisions and injury, I agree with NASA's expert judgment that the approach we adopt today preserves safety while we and our sister agencies study whether a different standard makes sense for these constellations. Space may seem like a long way away from the fight against COVID-19, but the rules we adopt here could have a profound impact on how rural America responds in future crises. I'm pleased we were able to spur American leadership in this promising industry while still promoting space safety. I do look forward to seeing the results. Thank you to IB for their hard work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. Today, our nation's commercial space sector is growing rapidly, and at the FCC, we have been working hard to help our industry seize the opportunities of the new space age. Under my leadership, the FCC has approved 14 applications and market access requests by 11 companies for non-geostationary satellite orbit constellation systems. Our action in this area fits well with the FCC's twin goals of closing the digital divide and promoting innovation. However, more satellites in space means a lot more traffic, especially in low Earth orbit. As we enter a new era in which tens of thousands of new satellites could be deployed, space debris is becoming a more serious concern. If you want a graphic illustration of the problem, just rewatch the movie Gravity. So, as the FCC facilitates the deployment of new satellite constellations, we also must address the problem of orbital debris. And address it we have. Today, for the first time in 15 years, we are adopting new rules to mitigate the threat posed by orbital debris, including regulations involving satellite design, better disposal procedures, and active collision avoidance. 15 years is an eternity in this fast-moving sector, and the time has come to address this critical issue. The rules that we adopt today take a balanced approach, mitigating the risk posed by orbital debris, while at the same time continuing to light a regulatory path for space-based innovations. Some of my colleagues asked that we move our consideration of certain issues from the report and order to the further notice so that we could seek additional comment on them, and I was happy to accommodate that request. But let me make clear that I plan on bringing these issues to closure once we have received additional feedback. Because while our action today is an important step toward addressing the threat posed by orbital debris, there is still more that needs to be done to protect the space environment. It is in everyone's interest to keep the final frontier safe for new and innovative uses. So I look forward to continuing the work with the private sector and other government agencies to implement common sense solutions to get this job done. I'd like to conclude by recognizing the FCC staff, and particularly the International Bureau, led by Chief Sullivan, for the ongoing efforts to mitigate space debris. I know firsthand what a complicated and painstaking process this was to bring this item to fruition, and I really appreciate the work you've done. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Khare?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Concur.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. As folks know, this is typically the time, now that the agenda has concluded, that I ask my colleagues if they'd like to make any announcements. Since we don't have visual cues to rely on, I'll just go in order to see if any commissioner has announcements. Commissioner O'Reilly?
No, none.
Commissioner Khare?
No, other than echoing your thanks to the FCC staff who have just been doing a tremendous job over the past few weeks. I'm sure in difficult circumstances for themselves, juggling work, kids, caring for loved ones. So thank you very much to FCC staff.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
No additional announcements.
Commissioner Starks?
No particular announcements by me either.
Okay, thank you. Well, I do have a few announcements before we adjourn. First is a sad announcement of the passing of Ileana Alfaro. Ms. Alfaro had been a clerk in the audio division of the Media Bureau since August of 2008. Started in the division as an 11th grade student under the STEP program, which is sponsored by Northwestern High School in Adelphi, Maryland, and that gave her the chance to work while she was in high school. She later transferred into the Pathways Internship program, which was designed to give students exposure to the federal workforce through paid employment. Her appointment under the Pathways program expired in August of 2016, and she was so eager to be a permanent employee, and we were so eager to have her that we did that and promoted her to the position of communications analyst. By all accounts, she was always an outstanding employee in the audio division, did her job in a very professional manner and with a smile on her face. Always a pleasure to be around. Unfortunately, that same year she became converted to a permanent employee, she also began treatment for a metastatic breast cancer. She lived very courageously with her diagnosis until the end, and she unfortunately succumbed to that illness on Monday, April 13th. She will greatly be missed by the FCC family, and our thoughts are with her family, her husband, David Camarana, and her kids during this difficult time. Next announcement is to congratulate Pam Yingling today. She retired last Friday from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau's licensing branch in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Pam started with the commission in 1974, and then she left the FCC for about 5 years to raise a family, and then she came back for quite the encore. She finished her career with 40 years of public service at the commission, all of it in Gettysburg. She progressed in her career until she became the lead industry analyst reviewing complex applications filed for public safety land mobile systems, which is the position that she held until her retirement. Ms. Yingling, we really thank you from afar for all that you've done for the commission and wish you a well-deserved and relaxing retirement. Aside from internal announcements, I also have one external announcement that I'm very excited to make. As folks know, the FCC has stood up in very short order and in very productive fashion the COVID-19 telehealth program, a $200 million program that implements authority and funding recently granted from Congress in the CARES Act. We have already distributed funding to 2 batches of applicants, and I'm pleased to announce today that we have a list of 6 applications that will be approved and will be released in batch 3. And those 6 applicants in alphabetical order are, number 1, the Anne Arundel Medical Center in Annapolis, Maryland. It was awarded $361,006 to implement video telehealth services to diagnose and treat COVID-19 patients across 11 medically underserved areas throughout central Maryland, and to support remote patient visits and monitoring to protect high-risk patients that have to be triaged out of the hospital or as part of an early discharge program for non-COVID patients to preserve hospital capacity. Next, number 2, is Christiana Care Health Services in Newark, Delaware. They were awarded $714,322 to provide and expand its telehealth and remote patient monitoring services to low-income, vulnerable patients, primarily in Newcastle County. And I'll add parenthetically, I visited Christiana Care during a visit to Delaware last year and was very impressed by their commitment to telehealth and look forward to seeing what this funding will enable. Number 3 is Garfield Health Center in Monterey Park, California, which was awarded $130,217 to provide remote care to low-income, vulnerable patients with underlying and or chronic health conditions that are at high risk for COVID-19, while triaging positive COVID-19 patients in the San Gabriel Valley. Number 4 is the HIV/AIDS Alliance for Region 2, which does business as Open Healthcare Clinic in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The HIV/AIDS Alliance was awarded $116,049 to expand its telehealth and remote patient monitoring capabilities to treat low-income, vulnerable patients with and without COVID-19. Number 5 is the NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York, New York, which was awarded $772,687 to expand telehealth services that allow high-risk, elderly, and vulnerable patients to stay at home while receiving complex care and chronic disease management. Last but not least, number 6 is the White Plains Hospital Medical Center in White Plains, New York, which has been awarded $165,832 to deploy telehealth services to treat high-risk and vulnerable patients with pre-existing pulmonary conditions and to implement telehealth services to address that facility's surging patient population while minimizing the risk of COVID-19 exposure for staff and patients without COVID-19. Congratulations to each of these awardees, and a heartfelt thank you to the incredible staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau, led by Chris Monteith and Trent Hargrader. They've gotten a huge number of applications, spending a ton of hours going through those applications and approving these excellent ones, many more to come. But we really thank you. I'm a firm believer, as I know my colleagues are, in the power of telehealth and telemedicine to deliver better health outcomes and access across this country. And perhaps during the most trying public health emergency the country has had in 100 years, you've really stepped up on the plate to help Americans become healthier. So thank you, Chris, Trent, and everybody in that bureau who's working on this issue for all you've done. If my colleagues don't have any further announcements, Madam Secretary, I would turn to you to announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting.
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Wednesday, May 13th, 2020.
Until then, we stand adjourned. Be safe, everybody.